I just want to welcome people in. I'll start talking since it's now time, and we'll keep letting in the new people. My name is Timmons Roberts. I'm professor at Brown University and the director of the Climate Social Science Network. Our materials at cssn.org. I want to thank our funders at the High Tide Foundation who have made this all possible. Really fantastic opportunity. I want to thank DIE, the German Development Institute, who's hosted us and really offered their space that, right here on the fringes of the UN negotiations in Bonn, Germany. And especially Stefan Bauer, Okalu, and the director, and Ines, who's going to be speaking with us today, who's going to be moderating the panel with Frank Biermann. I guess I could go on. We're going to have a little wrap-up session after this. This will be about an hour. And then we'll, the members will then go on and have a reception online. So thanks everybody for coming. And I'm going to hand it right off to Stefan Bauer of the German Development Institute. Thank you, Stefan, for being great to work with on this.
Thank you, Timmons, and I can only echo and reverse the thanks and appreciation that you have just shared. It's really a great pleasure for us to be working with the Climate Social Science Network, which will go far. And yeah, welcome, Frank. Thank you, Timmons and team. And I will keep it short here and hand over to Ines Dombrowski, who is the head and chair of our research program on environmental governance and transformation to sustainability. And she will welcome Frank on behalf of German Development Institute and moderate this session and obviously also the Q&A session that will follow Frank's input, which we are all thrilled and excited to hear very shortly. So Ines, the floor is over to yours, please.
Thanks a lot, Stefan. Thanks for the introduction. And obviously, I'm not Okalu Matis as announced in the program, but I'm stepping in for her as she fell unfortunately sick. So I'm very happy to moderate the session on reflections from the science activism frontier, the case of solar geoengineering, and I'm really delighted to welcome Frank Biermann to give an input on this topic. So Frank is a professor of global sustainability governance at Utrecht University. He's the director of the ERC Global Goals Project, founder of the Earth System Governance Project, and editor of the respective journal. His research focuses on new models for effective and equitable global governance in an area of human-caused planetary transformation and disruption. So Frank, you have launched a global initiative calling for an international non-use agreement on solar geoengineering and initiated an open letter to that in that regard. And it's against this background that we have invited you to give us some insights on some recent struggles around solar geoengineering, and we hope to reflect a bit on the role of social science in this context, and also the role of social scientists. So basically, the session will not be a session discussing solar geoengineering and whether it's a good or bad thing per se, but really the role of us as social scientists in this regard, or in general in view of climate change, and to what extent we are already political, or we need to become more political, and what that actually means. And solar engineering is the case study here. Yeah, and with that, I would like to hand over to you, Frank. And I think you have about 30 minutes. I might give you a signal if you go much longer. And other than that, we will then, I'm looking forward to questions and comments from the floor in the discussion round afterwards. So thanks a lot, Frank, and the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Ines. Wonderful, thank you. Let me just share my slides. Can you see them? They're all there? Yep.
Yes.
Looks great, Frank.
Yes.
Okay, cool. Yes. Good. Okay, good. Good. Okay, thank you so much for the invitation and for the introduction. So I want to talk in 30 minutes a bit about I want to combine three topics. One is climate obstruction, the topic of the conference. One is scholar activism, a topic for this afternoon, and all combining with the case of solar geoengineering, where I try to bring it all together. I mean, the fight against climate constructionism, solar activism, and a better climate policy. So just to, oops. Okay, so in a sense, I mean, how I see the development of climate policy, just very, very roughly, in a sense, we have a development of climate denial, climate delay, and the newest way is kind of climate destruction. I would count geoengineering as part of this. So I'm not talking about denial, I'm not talking about delay. This is already a huge topic in this community. I want to talk about climate destruction in the form of geoengineering. And you can see it, I mean, just bring it briefly, in a sense, on one slide, that geoengineering is increasingly proposed by a number of actors, scientists, but also civil society, NGOs, lobbyists, as a plan B for insufficient climate policies. So the proposition is that geoengineering would help us to buy time. The question is, of course, buying time for whom? And I believe that the potential of geoengineering, the idea, the proposal of geoengineering threatens to become a new approach in climate obstruction. You can see it a little bit on this on the graph that I brought here, which is cut and paste from the website of the Climate Overshoot Commission, a new international commission that is supposed to discuss all these new approaches of geoengineering in the climate context. I've just spoken to them this morning, actually. So what they are analyzing is a new space of climate policy where you have still climate emission reduction on the top, but you add complementary here also carbon dioxide removal, you add solar radiation management, solar reflection technology, maybe more adaptation, and you bring it all together in one larger context where the one might complement the others. And you can, in a sense, play around a little bit. You can even do cost-benefit analysis. And here the argument can be, and this I think is climate obstruction, that emissions reductions at some point might be seen, might be argued to be too expensive, unfeasible, unrealistic, or surely too late, and that therefore we have to engage in all these kind of other proposals and other technologies. The one that is very much discussed already is what one could call Geoengineering Type 2, which is the idea to remove carbon from the atmosphere, carbon dioxide removal. There are lots of proposals out there that run from plant-based approaches, afforestation, down to industrial processes and direct air capture, getting the carbon artificially out of the atmosphere. There are lots of proposals. Each approach to be successful would need to be huge in scale. And they all have their own climate justice implications. For example, when it comes to land, when it comes to food security, and a variety of other important concerns. Many people do not call these approaches geoengineering anymore. So there's, in a sense, a new type of debate only focused on carbon dioxide removal. And I also will, in my talk today, not focus on this particular set of proposals here in this talk. Instead, I will focus on solar geoengineering, which is a totally different idea. The idea to artificially dim the sun, the idea to reflect a part of the sunlight to cool the planet for some time. It's called geoengineering, solar geoengineering. Now, there also are new terms that are being pushed by those who are proposing and advocating these technologies, such as climate alteration technologies or novel climate protection technology. So these are new terms that are being pushed forward also maybe to make these ideas a little bit more acceptable to the larger public. Some of these approaches could be at the local level, but mostly they are discussed at the planetary level as a planetary proposal to dim the sun by injecting, in particular, that is the most discussed proposal, injecting aerosols in the upper layers of the atmosphere, and therefore to temporarily cool the planet. So these are some discussions that are out there. And proponents of these kind of technologies, or at least of research on these kind of technologies, argue that we would need these kind of technologies because we could use them, or we would need them at some point as a temporary measure to buy time until full decarbonization. So in a sense, that over some in 2050, 2060, when we are briefly overshooting in a way the carbon budget, then these technologies would be handy in a sense to cool the planet for 1 or 2 generations. Others argue also we would need these technologies as a fail-safe in case something goes wrong or we just simply totally mess up climate policies. And for all of these kind of reasons to have this as security, advocates argue that we need to research these technologies now to better understand whether they work and to have them now available. We need to have them now in the labs, we need to have them in our technology portfolio because politicians, decision makers might want to have these technologies in 2030, 2040, 2050 at any point of time. And all these debates have over the last 1 or 2 years led to a tremendous normalization of the idea of solar geoengineering as a part of the climate policy portfolio. In the United States, the National Academy of Sciences has published a report that was calling for more research on these technologies. For example, the journal Nature has published an editorial in which they also argue that we should invest, give a chance to solar geoengineering. And there have been also proposals, for example, for field experiments of these technologies. For example, in Sweden last year by Harvard University, they were eventually stopped by civil society resistance from indigenous people. But in overall, the speed of normalization of solar geoengineering as a policy option has increased quite a bit. And I think this is a tremendous problem. So there are a number of problems. I want to list 3. Number 1 is, of course, that the science of these kind of proposals is extremely uncertain. So they are totally very poorly understood to what extent these, what are the side effects, what are the effects of these kind of technologies. What is clear is the impacts will likely vary across the regions. Different continents will be differently affected. There will be uncertain effects on regional weather patterns in different countries in different degrees. Politically, it's clear that you could employ these kind of technologies just by very few countries. So technically, only a few countries could use them. You don't necessarily need to have cooperation of all countries. And this makes it politically, I think, also very dangerous as a technology idea. It seems that these technologies are relatively cheap, which is also a big problem if you add these risky but potentially cheap technologies into the climate policy mix. They are also always risky and at the planetary scale. But I believe that the more research is not necessarily a solution here, because in the sense that science cannot never really give us full certainty to what extent these technologies work. The risk will always be there. You can see it. I mean, I try to symbolize this in a way by this graph, where you see on the left side the world, how the modeler sees it. That is kind of the model world, how science is understanding the planet. But this is not necessarily the way how the planet really functions. And the hope would be there in a sense, or the experiment would be that we would try to deploy these technologies with a limited understanding as an experiment of which we would not know the results. We would never know in a sense what would really happen. And this would lead us to a situation that I saw it very much in this movie that many of you might have seen, Don't Look Up, a situation where we as 8 billion people would have to sit here while a group of scientists with the support from a group of countries would try out these technologies, while we all would have to wait and would have to hope that these technologies in the end work out and that the model calculations are correct and are leading to the result that we're supposed to be. But I think there's another issue which is equally important, and this is the implausibility of global governance for these kind of new technologies. And again, a photo from this movie, Don't Look Up, it shows a little bit how governance of these technologies would essentially evolve by few countries, the military sector, few investors that might, in a sense, try to develop this together. If you really want to invest in these kind of technologies, deploy these technologies, what would need is a system to take decisions on the intensity of the deployment, on the place and the manner of deployment. I mean, how and where would you deploy it actually? How long would you deploy it actually? And also about the responsibility and the compensation for harm that might be caused by the deployment of these. I mean, these are all decisions that would need to be taken at planetary scale in the current political system. And I believe that fair and just governance of these kind of decisions are very implausible to the extent that it would need to involve all countries. It would affect definitely climate justice, that the different countries would be affected quite differently from these technologies. And that means also that those countries that are potentially most affected, or all countries, need to have an effective say in the deployment of these kind of technologies. That means all countries need to be involved in decision making. And this, I think, is a system that I think is very, very difficult to foresee in the current system of international relations. If you look at the current United Nations system, the General Assembly of the United Nations totally lacks enforcement powers. Its decisions are not binding. The UN Environment Programme is also was not designed to deal with planetary engineering in the way that solar engineering would entail. The United Nations Framework Convention equally lacks any institutional force that would be needed, and decision-making procedure that would be needed to deploy and manage the deployment of solar engineering technologies at planetary scale. There is the Security Council, sometimes mentioned, which has a mandate to act if a certain situation affects peace, international peace and security, but it surely lacks international legitimacy to really effectively regulate these kind of technologies. And it is dominated by the veto power, as we all know, by the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. And this makes it also not the appropriate body to manage and to govern the deployment of technologies of solar engineering at the planetary scale. And in general also, the question would be, I mean, how would we take decisions on these issues? I mean, most United Nations bodies are following the principle of one country, one vote. And the question is, to what extent would powerful countries accept these kind of decision procedures for issues that are so important and so intense as solar geoengineering at the planetary scale? For example, I mean, if we would follow the system of one country, one vote, the United States would have only one vote out of 194. And if we would go to a kind of a more democratic matter, like one person, one vote that has never been applied at the national level, even then the United States would only have 4.2% of the global vote. And most of the United Nations decision-making procedures, developing countries have a large majority. So the question is, would the United States and would the United States Senate, I mean, the country in a way that is most able and most interested in deploying or in developing or researching technologies for solar engineering, would the United States Senate accept such a voting procedure in which the United States would have only a very, very tiny vote out of all? Would the Russians accept it? Would China accept it? And then if these powerful countries would not accept majority decision on the deployment of solar geoengineering, so what would then be the alternatives? And here we are entering a space of geoengineering, solar geoengineering, without any stable democratic procedures. That would be the rule of the many, the rule of the few over the many, the few who would kind of then engage in these technologies without effective co-decisions of all the other countries. Rich countries might go ahead without the United Nations mandate. But what happens if then other countries disagree? What happens if different blocks of countries have different views and different interests in the area of geoengineering? Some articles are discussing already counter-engineering, I mean, countermeasures against some countries that are engaging in geoengineering in the way that other countries do not agree with. And we might even enter a space where industry and rich corporations or rich philanthropists, the so-called green fingers, might also engage in these kind of debates and also in these kind of technologies and maybe even in the deployment. They will surely not do it alone. You always need a country, in a sense, to deploy solar engineering, but there is certainly the possibility that rich philanthropists, the billionaires of the world, are playing a role in these debates because some of them have already actively expressed interest. So the final problem is that solar engineering might also, I think that is very much related to the idea of obstruction here discussed at this conference, might also lead to what I call the capitalist escape route, in a way that these speculative hopes that these technologies would be available at some point, that they are technically possible and that they're possibly quite cheap, even though risky, but quite cheap, that these ideas about these technologies could eventually threaten the commitments that we are having right now to mitigation, and they can reduce incentive for some countries, for some businesses and some societies to do their utmost. So in the sense that these kind of technologies would not be the plan B, in the case the climate policy fails, it would lead to the failure of climate policy. It would delay climate policy, it would obstruct climate policy, and it could become a powerful argument for energy companies to delay and obstruct decarbonization. And I think this is especially in these years when more and more countries are announcing that they will try to reduce their emissions to net zero, especially in these years. This, I think, is one of the most powerful risks that come with these kind of technologies, and not only with their deployment, but even with their research. Even the development of these technologies might have this kind of obstructive impact on climate policy right now in this important decade. So I think for that reason, it's important that we stop this normalization of geoengineering. And I would argue that we need political action right now from governments, all other actors, United Nations, to stop the normalization of solar geoengineering as a future policy option. And for that reason, a couple of colleagues came together and argued in January this year for an international non-use agreement on solar geoengineering. And this is coming back to the discussion that we will have. It is an example of scholar activism. This is a network of scholars. 350 scholars right now have signed and supported an open letter for the international non-use agreement. And this is an example where scientists stop up and stand up and take a stand for a particular political position. So the proposal is that governments, once they would support this idea in the non-use agreement, they would agree not to deploy technologies for solar engineering. They would agree not to publicly fund this development of such technologies. They would agree to ban the outdoor experiments of such technologies, not to grant patent rights for such technologies, and also to object to the institutionalization of planetary solar engineering as a policy option in international institutions. So these are the 5 elements of the proposal that is at the core of this idea of an international non-use agreement on solar geoengineering. So as I said, this is an example of scholar activism. 350 scientists have signed this open letter. It is out there. And I invite everybody here in the audience who is interested to consider signing and supporting this letter. The website is there, solargeoeng.org, and this is where all the information, all the signatories and supporters are listed. So let me now come a little bit to the experiences and of solar activism and reflection on solar activism in this particular space. So this is an example of one important activity. So now some reflections and ideas. Number one, I think scholar activism becomes more and more important. I think that the old way of doing science, which is kind of, you see here on these photos, on these paintings, is over. I think the old way of science, where we're sitting in our ivory towers, is not compatible anymore with the climate crisis that we are in. So I think that we have to take the climate crisis as it is, as a major planetary crisis. It's not a drill, it's not just a theoretical possibility, it's not just there. It is one of the major planetary crises, societal crises that we have in our generation. And everybody knows it, of course, on this call, but I think sometimes even scientists or social scientists are in this kind of mix of denial. And on the one hand, you study it, you write books about it, you write papers about it, but I think it's very important that we take this much more seriously. And that means also that academics have to speak out much more. I think this old idea of informing decision makers by writing a complex paper and putting it on the website or publishing in the journal is no longer enough. I think academics in the current crisis of climate policy, or maybe other crises as well, of course, need to speak up and need to be engaged much stronger than they have been in the past. I think the old times have changed. We have to leave the ivory towers and we have to fully engage in political structures. And I think there's, in a way, also less need for the next paper or the next conference presentation. We have to speak out and we have to get together and we have to take over these fights, which is the solar engineering is one example. So it is one example of these type of scholar activism that I really believe is absolutely necessary and very important for our time, our generation. We have 10 years maybe, and these are the most important 10 years in our generation, I think, if we want to stop climate change. On the other hand, I think it's very important also that we define scholar activism very carefully. And these are some of my personal reflections. I mean, maybe others can certainly also disagree or agree with some of these reflections. I think this is maybe something that we want to discuss at this final hour of this important conference. I mean, number one, I think it's very important that we keep the distance or a certain boundary between scholar activism, which is not simply activism. And we have tried to deal with this also in our solar geoengineering non-use agreement activity. So I think it's very important that when we speak as academics, that number one, we only speak about what we sort of understand. I mean, that's, I mentioned just sort of, because of course, you should not only talk about the most narrow field where you have written 20 papers, but if a journalist asks any kind of outlandish question, I think it's very important to always talk only about what there's a agreement on, where some knowledge is about. Of course, remaining open for counter arguments and always important is also nuance. And I think this is a difference between NGOs and their activism and the scholarly activism that maybe comes from the academic world, especially when people speak as an academic. I mean, what people do as a citizen is something different, but once you speak as an academic, I think these are very, very important elements in this way forward. And secondly, I think it's very important that also that we are different also, of course, from NGOs, and that we maintain this difference also, that we are speaking as scientists and we try to link our arguments to the extent possible to scientific research, to scientific findings from us and from our colleagues and from our communities, and that we are trying to maintain this difference between NGOs and the academic community speaking out. And in this initiative for the International Non-Use Agreement, we have tried to do so. So what we have done is we have made a clear distinction by those who support the open letter between academics who are signatories, first signatories and later signatories of the open letter. So everybody who signs this has to self-identify under certain criteria as an academic. That was very important to us. Civil society can also support the open letter and can support the call for non-use agreement, but for this we have the special category of endorsement. So here we ask civil society organizations to endorse the letter, and civil society has also not been involved in the drafting of the letter. So the letter was really written, the entire proposal was written by academics, from academics as an academic initiative. But civil society can, of course, endorse the idea, and hopefully at some point also governments will endorse the idea and will take action. And then in addition, as a third option for citizens, we have launched what is called a petition. So there's 3 different ways of engagement. That means, of course, that some of us can engage 3 times as an academic, civil society, and as a citizen, but we have made this distinction very clear. And the final point is, of course, that value decisions are inherent of you. I mean, you can't have social science without being in somewhat having to deal with values. But I think it's very important to make them explicit, and we make them explicit in our case. For example, when we talk about that solar engineering cannot be governed globally, we make it very clear that we are meaning here fair and just and a sort of democratic global governance. Of course, I mean, as social scientists, international relations scholars, we know that unjust governance is possible theoretically. I mean, I could develop a governance system which is totally technocratic and imperialistic for solar engineering that might even work. I mean, a lot of global governance is, in a sense, is not just and it is not democratic. But what we are saying is that a system that is fair, that is just, that is acceptable, that is democratic, that involves all the countries, that this system is implausible. Other systems might be possible. And then the last point, before the last point, some personal experience with scholar activism. That's also for those who might want to also be engaged or also launch these kind of initiatives. I mean, number one, I think that's one thing that's very important. I mean, maybe we also in our initiative, we didn't realize it in the beginning. It is becoming politics. I mean, it's kind of, one leaves the ivory tower, and that means also one has left the ivory tower. So one is really engaging in real political struggle with real political actors who have a very, very strong interest and who are actively fighting against these propositions. And this is different from the scientific discourse when you go to a conference and you have a presentation and some learned exchanges and some footnotes are being exchanged. I mean, this is really becoming politics. And that means also that it's not always fun. That means also that on the other side, there might be professional lobbyists who are well paid, have a tremendous CV, and are just full-time engaged in proposing the other argument. Not necessarily always in the most academic way in a sense. So, I mean, it's kind of clear. So in a sense, one has to accept that these are political conflicts and that it's not always funny activities. I think one lesson that we are also drawing is, I mean, it's also not too surprising. I mean, academics cannot run independent campaigns. I mean, it's just not how we are structured. I mean, universities, we have so many different things and duties and obligations. So it's not possible for academics to turn academic networks into campaigns. I think it's also not the idea. So here it's, of course, important to find and to engage with professional NGOs or any other actor who is interested to align with this case and then trust to build up coalitions that are working together and engaged in these kind of activities. I mean, one thing is, I think it's very important that these kind of conflicts can become nasty and they can harm careers. So I think therefore it's important to the extent needed to also protect junior faculty members. I think that's just, I mean, it sounds a little bit too drastic maybe, but I think that's very important. So I think it's important here that, I mean, especially those who have nothing to lose, I mean, tenured staff, I mean, that they are kind of in the first row and that they take also most of the counter activities and that junior faculty staff is to the extent possible or needed also protected. And then, of course, another thing is, I mean, you don't talk too much when you're live recorded. We could share lots of little anecdotes and little examples and here and there. I wouldn't do it now because this is a live recording, but maybe at some point we can share more insights in a different setting. And the last slide is then the role of science networks and then also the role of CSN. I mean, I understand this is also very important for, it has been discussed before this talk, this maybe also for the plenary discussion. I can't speak for CSN. I have some experiences with the Earth System Governance Project, which is also a large network of social scientists who are dealing with these kind of issues, dealing with global environmental change and questions of social science and governance. And here I think that science networks, I mean, to take a political stand, they have to, number one, to have procedures that are really leading to legitimacy, give legitimacy to such a position, to any political stand. That's number one. And number two, they have to be globally balanced in their interest. So it's, in a sense, sometimes you have science networks who are focusing implicitly on issues that are important for the global south, for the global north. For example, we never talked about the election of Donald Trump because I always said, I mean, there's so many presidents around on this planet. I mean, either we talk about all presidents or we talk about no president or other issues, which are what I call sometimes the CNN headlines. I mean, issues that are very much pushed forward in the global north. And the political activities of networks should not focus only on those issues that are only important for some part of the globe. And as a consequence of number one and number two, the Earth System Governance Project actually has, to my knowledge, never taken a political stand as a network because the legitimacy of a decision-making procedure is not there and has never been tried to establish. And the second point is more easy to address. But in a sense, the first point is that if there is no legitimacy, I think networks should also not speak as a network. And I think that's also one of the problems you have sometimes with the American Meteorological Association, for example, that is speaking out for solar geoengineering. So I think that is a problematic position in the sense that as a professional network, you take a political position in a way that is not very transparent and not very clear. Of course, on the other hand, it's clear that many members of the Earth System Governance Project, they're all politically highly engaged. I mean, this is not a conflict in a way. And also it so happens that this International Non-Use Agreement Initiative is to a large extent supported by the members of the Earth System Governance Project. So you have an overlap there, but it's not an official position from the Earth System Governance Project. So, I mean, this is my experience from the Earth System Governance Project, but I'm also very curious to hear how friends from the CSN network are looking at these matters and how they see this, and maybe also to other experiences with scholar activism. I see that the hand of Prakash is already up there. So I think that he has also lots of share from his experiences. I'm very looking forward to discuss these kind of issues. So in a sense, more information on this particular initiative you find at solargeoeng.org and the Twitter handle solargeoeng. But I think there are also lots of other examples, I'm sure, about these kind of initiatives. And I think it's very important. I think we need more of these initiatives. I mean, this was one where I have been involved, but I mean, there are surely many, many more important issues where we need to have scholar activism and where we have to stand up and we have to take up the fight and take our knowledge into the trenches of the political debate and the political conflict. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Frank, for these enlightening insights into first, the politics of solar geoengineering. Second, your thoughts on scholarly activism, and third, also your reflections on experiences with it, and maybe the lessons that need to be drawn from this. We have already quite a lively chat here. And maybe we can quickly walk through it so that we are fully up to speed. And obviously, you have not had the opportunity to look into it yet, Frank. But I have the impression that most of them are more comments right now and not really questions yet. We have some hints on other publications on global governance by Christine Müller. We have Archana agreeing on scholar activism and hinting at some century ago activists, including Marx. Then Guy Edwards again on the importance of activism and the possible pitfalls. Maybe Guy, in case you would like to comment a bit more in depth later, please raise your hand. Nora Krüger on really thanking you. Then the hint by Carlos on Roger Pirke's book on The Honest Broker. Delta Marner on concerned scientists. I don't know whether you would like to comment more on this. And then a lengthy comment by Pam Jordan on experiences including students. In case you would like to speak up on it, let us know. And then Ken Love, we have a question. Okay, so I suggest that we first take Prakash, who has raised his hand, and then maybe Ken Love wants to come in. So Prakash first.
Thank you for this really wonderful panel, and thanks, Frank, for that masterly overview and such thought-provoking comments and questions. So first, full disclosure, I'm one of the original initiators of the No Use Agreement. So we are part of the same club, but I'm going to play the devil's advocate here. And I also want to flag the work that we have done as part of the geoengineering working group within CSSN. And we are beginning to have some of the similar discussions. So I think this is really productive and many ways quite timely. So my question is, and for those in the audience who may not be trained as social scientists, there is a long-standing social science debate about positive or objective approaches to doing science or social science versus normative approaches to doing social science, where you strongly lean towards a particular position, a particular type of norm, and that's why it's called normative. So that's where I'm coming at it from. So here is my question, and I'm trying to frame it very carefully, but please let me know if it's not clear. So, I think it's fair to say that, compared to say 30 years ago, now there's a much stronger consensus within a broad sweep of social science disciplines and scholars that at some level, all science is normative. Because, you think about 1.5 degree or 2 degree, right? These are political goals that have been decided. And now when climate scientists, the IPCC makes their recommendations about 1.5 degrees through certain routes versus other kinds of routes, that these are all choices that the scientists make to create a particular kind of analysis in the pursuit of 1.5 degree or 2 degrees, right? So if we all agree on that kind of understanding of a sort of a critical understanding of science, then those who are advocating strongly for solar geoengineering, they are way out of bounds. They are way on the other side of doing some kind of normative stuff. I mean, I'm only using parliamentary language here, but that's not a scientific enterprise. And so when we counter them with different values compared to certain kind of values that they hold dear, and we call ourselves scholar activists, we are sort of, in a very strange way, we are actually sort of making this dichotomy, and we are sort of somewhat reinforcing this argument that advocates of solar geoengineering are doing science and we are doing scholar activism, right? And again, this is not something that I have resolved or anything, but this is an obvious question that we should think about, and I thought we would benefit from your reflections on this, Frank.
Yeah, I think I would like to hand this question directly over to you, Frank.
Well, it's a very, very good point. We have to discuss it more, and thanks, of course, for working with us for so long on these issues together. I think the one is about science, like social science and solar engineering. I mean, there are people who are using a very kind of, they're writing books about governance of solar engineering in a positive way. So they're developing certain ideas which are kind of based on the same kind of approaches that some of us using, but then based on different value system. And I think in a sense, I mean, I wouldn't say that the folks who are supporting geoengineering from the social science perspective, that they're not scientists. I think they are as scientists, but they bring in different value systems, especially when it comes to global governance. If you look at the publications of those who are proposing global governance solutions to solar engineering, I mean, how could this be governed? They have a different value system. I mean, for me, I think that's kind of one point. I mean, I read lots of these books in a sense, and they have a different view of how the world could or should be structured normatively in the terms of what is the role of the great powers. So that's what I mentioned in this, in the point that is theoretically, you can imagine a system of governance that takes these decisions on solar engineering, but it's not democratic, it's not fair, it's based on great power imperialism. That's what Kevin, who's also here on the talk, I believe, has called stratospheric imperialism. I mean, it's also a fantastic term in a sense for these issues. And I think this is also based on science. But I want to bring, because you mentioned the 1.5, I mean, there's another area maybe what we could also put on the table. I have in another activity been also relatively critical of the planetary boundaries and these kind of approaches. And this is also an interesting thing where you have scientists collectively in some form deciding on the operational space of humanity. And this is on the one hand, I mean, it's fine, and it's also partially based on natural processes, but on the other hand, it brings in a lot of normative values. And you mentioned the 1.5, or you mentioned the 2 degree, and these kind of values come in with many of these boundaries or Earth system targets or science-based targets that we have in the current way. And here, I think it's also important to discuss the role of scientists in these kind of networks, social and natural scientists in these kind of networks, where scientists are trying to set the targets for policy at the global level, planetary targets, without necessarily having the full legitimacy and mandate to do these things. I mean, that's kind of another discussion that I didn't raise, but it is also related in a bit to solar engineering, because this is again very much expert-driven, this technocratic debate, and lots of people who work on these issues have a certain idea about that smart people, I mean, this is a quotation from somebody actually, that smart people have to take over and have to take now and advance the solutions because climate change, climate policies are not functioning. So anyway, I think we need to discuss at some point more practically this issue of who is a scientist, who not, because I think there are social scientists also on both sides. It's just that the value systems are fundamentally different.
Yeah, just a quick clarification. I specifically was thinking of the climate scientists who are advocating for climate solar geoengineering. And from a societal perspective, I think it's much more challenging for us to argue that they have a normative program, right? So that's, and I think that's a great point about the governance scholars, and that's a different discussion. But climate scientists advocating for solar geoengineering, which is a big phenomenon, that's really interesting to think about. But yes, absolutely, we need to continue talking more about it.
Yeah, thanks. And maybe, I mean, one point also to be made would be I guess you also playing a double role, aren't you, Frank? I mean, in your writing scientifically about what solar engineering governance would imply, and you started the campaign with other colleagues. We have a comment. We had some exchange also in the chat on looking into NGOs, but I think I would also leave that in the chat right now. I'm wondering whether Pauline would like to come in with her experiences on social scientists.
Hi, yes, I have to apologize. I only just saw Timmons. I saw your tweet yesterday afternoon or this morning, in fact. So I'm a little bit new to this network here, but I'm really interested. Partly, I have been part of XR Social Scientists for some time, and I was really interested to hear your talk just now because as I was just saying in the chat, but that XR Social Scientist is mostly social scientists who study social movements and who are contributing to helping XR basically, and I do think that's a hugely valuable role to play. But of course, I'm an anthropologist and I don't do this actually myself. I'm just interested in activism and addressing climate change. And it was just interesting to hear your talk because you're coming from a different perspective and you were mapping out different approaches to how academics can engage with activism. And for example, what you're saying about, I think the Earth Alliance, sorry, I didn't quite catch it, but the academic bodies or networks can themselves become more activist or be more, I suppose, outspoken. But I just think maybe and I'm so sorry, I am completely new to this, but just I'm personally really interested in mapping out sort of quite clearly what the different contributions are, both in terms of different institutions and networks, but also disciplines. Just because I'm an anthropologist, and of course anthropology is quite different to other social scientists, and maybe just sort of slightly disaggregating that as well. But yeah, thank you. I'm really happy to be here just now. Thank you. That was all.
Okay. Thank you. I don't know, Frank, do you want to react or we just take it as a comment?
I mean, there's of course different communities. Both are very important. I mean, there is of course social science to study and to support social movements. I mean, that's of course extremely important. This case was different. Was kind of scholars taking a political stand themselves, which is actually also interesting to be studied, of course. I mean, it would be also interesting to have anthropologists in a sense to study this initiative and to see how it evolves and also the success factors. And that's, I think, also very important because, I mean, how and when do scholars who take a public stand, especially in these larger networks with open letter and 350 signatories, etc., which is kind of a big initiative in a sense. No? So what are the conditions of effectiveness? And there is research, I think it's also going around in the chat about the impact of NGOs, civil society, various other political actors. But in a sense, I mean, what makes such networks effective in taking a political position? I think that's kind of would be interesting to have this studied, maybe even by anthropologists. But this is a different debate. So this is kind of a different debate, and especially I think what's important to study are these kind of this boundary work between NGOs and scholars and scientists in these matters. I think that's kind of very important also for us in a sense, because it determines also where we see ourselves. I mean, are we becoming NGOs? Probably not. But where exactly, what makes us different from NGOs in these activities, and what makes us, where are we more similar? And I see lots of hands flying up. I mean, it's very good.
Yeah, exactly. And I suggest that we now take 3 hands in a row, and then you can respond to that. And I start with Timmons.
Thanks, Ines and Frank. That was great. I would just to sort of answer the question a minute ago about how does CSSN work and what do we see but it reflects on, that was Pauline, on your last point, Frank, and that is we're seeing ourselves as sort of the scholars who are producing the useful materials for those seeking to advance climate action. So we're acting as scholars doing systematic research, but we're informed by the needs of the civil society organizations, investigators, litigators, politicians, businesses, whoever is advancing climate action. We want to know what they need. So we're sort of the research capacity. We do get approached about, signing on to sign-on letters and joining coalitions and so on. And we have chosen not to. We definitely encourage all the members to do so. But we do think there's value in having some of the legitimacy, at least of being, sort of the social scientists conducting research that others can take forward. So I guess I would leave it there. There's much more to say, but that's where we've sort of so far chosen to put ourselves on that line.
Yeah, thanks, Timmons, for elaborating on the CSSN's approach. Ina Mola is next.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Frank, for the very nice overview and presentation of the non-use agreement. I wanted to pick up on your comment about protecting early career scholars and keeping them away from the front lines. But for those who are interested in sort of contributing to the cause, let's say, without being on the front lines and putting the career at stake, what would you recommend in terms of how, like now being on the advocacy side of things, what do you think is useful in terms of input that also early career scholars can provide?
Thank you, Ina, for that question about early careers scholars' role. And Arti, please. Arti, do you want to go next? And then we let Frank react.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, now we can hear you.
Okay. Yes, I'm at the Bonn meeting, so I'm on my telephone, so I will not put on my camera. But I just wanted to pick up on what Prakash was saying, actually. And I think this is a very important point, and maybe this is just worth clarifying about us. I mean, I think we're all agreed that as critical social scientists, we need to bring our perspective more forcefully into, and collectively into sort of be more clear about diverse perspectives on an issue like solar geoengineering, which might otherwise be dominated by, one side only. But I think equally for me, what scholar activism means is that this question about how much of what we say as academics might also be seen as taking a normative position. And I think for me, that's what I increasingly have come to associate with. That's my understanding of solar activism, that I want to be clearer about my normative position. And then in responding to Prakash, I don't think that suggests at all that that the other side or the advocates are not don't have normative positions as well. I think the point is, of course, that we all have a normative position, and to be clearer about our own normative position is, for me, sort of at the heart of scholar activism. It's not about it's not as Timmons was also saying it's not about doing the kind of activism that other actors, civil society, etc., might be better positioned to do, but it's about making clear the normative position that underpins one's analysis to some extent, and then also related to what the CSSN network is doing in this space and the working group on the politics of geoengineering is to call out the normative positions underpinning the other side. And I think that is to acknowledge that the normativeness is everywhere and to call out whatever. So it's not just about the global governance diversity of values and norms that Frank was pointing to, that's very important. But also, as Prakash was saying, climate scientists advocating for solar geo, that it's difficult to pin them down as advocating a normative position. I would argue that it's not difficult. That, of course, we've tried to do that in our scientific analyses as well, to try to point out very potentially problematic notions of equity in climate modelers, which advocate for solar geoengineering, etc. But also, as part of our working group, we might want to call out how equity and justice considerations, explicitly normative positions that are used by the other side, what is the content of them, and to interrogate those assumptions. So that's what I wanted to say.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Archie, for pointing out, this needs to bring out our normative positions and basically always, yeah. So we are, running towards the end of the session. We have 4 minutes left. Steffen, you are one of the organizers. Do you still want to chip in quickly, or otherwise I would hand over to Frank to react on these 3 statements that have been made. Frank, are you with us?
I'm here. I thought you wanted to have Steffen.
No, Steffen.
I withdraw in the interest of time, and I will.
Oh, okay. Okay. No.
Remarks. So
good. Yeah. Thanks a lot. Very, very useful points. For Ina's point, of course, what I mentioned with protection doesn't mean that. We need early career scholars. That's very, very important. What we need is now we have a state. We have reached a certain impact in a sense, and I wouldn't say outnumbered in a sense, but there's so much activity and so much that we could do on this non-use agreement for which we would need lots of colleagues to join to do research, but also to do very focused research in a sense what Arti has said, calling out certain normative assumptions, criticize certain papers. So just also we have a blog now, we have a briefing inside page, so we try to have more and more information on that. And this is all run by colleagues. This is a scientific network. We don't have Bill Gates behind us. We don't have these huge billionaires who are funding to some extent the other side. So the academic networks, scholarly networks can only rely on the work of scholars in a sense. That's kind of the idea of scholarly networks. And their early career and any career stage is extremely important. What I just meant in this point is, that one has to also realize that not everybody wants to be in the first row, especially when the criticism comes, and especially when there are also, people have, especially if they don't have tenure, are much more vulnerable. And I think that's very important to take into account. But early career research are really crucial, and everybody is absolutely welcome. We organize now working groups on different topics, which lead to academic papers, but lead also to other outputs. And for that, it would be fantastic to have more early career research. Just join us if you're interested in this particular issue, which I think is really fundamental for this particular decade in climate policy. Because if you're missing that boat, then climate policy will go in a totally different direction that we might not want to have. So I think it sounds for many people slightly esoteric, this solar geoengineering stuff, but I believe it's really fundamental, and especially fundamental right now. And then the point of Timmons, I don't know, I think I very respectfully and timely, I think I would slightly, the point is, one is the policy proposals in a way. And that's the point. The one is to provide academic research and papers and books to policy, to other actors, to civil society, critical communities, etc. But I think it's also very important to get one step further. And this is what we did in a sense in this non-use agreement. We didn't say it's all critical, it's very bad, the solar engineering. So we had a clear proposal. We said, this is a proposal that is not just falling out of the sky, it's linked to existing governance solutions, non-use. I mean, that's we have with chemical weapons, you have biological weapons, you have, I mean, it's all drawing on different other treaties and different other global governance. And we said, this could be an idea, this non-use agreement that could be a nice thing that could work out. It could work in a sense in the current system. It could be a nice, interesting policy proposals, and the NGOs are picking up. So we get endorsements from civil society, but this one step for social scientists to not only criticize, but to also have a proposal, a concrete proposal, not only saying this, but a concrete proposal. I think that is the way forward. It's also done by many. There's the other campaign on the fossil fuel, treaty, which is similar in a sense. I mean, we are actually talking to these folks also because we are kind of on the same campaign, so to speak, and we also have to work together. And I think this is kind of what I would see as scholarly activism. And the legitimacy part, I'm not sure. I think we are. I mean, I wouldn't see that we are not legitimate just because we say this is a policy proposal that we are supporting. I think, and sometimes, I mean, we have to be also careful. I think that we are not too much sitting back and driven by the other side, so to speak, into a certain corner where we are no longer politically active and no longer politically effective. So legitimacy, I mean, we are very concerned about this, of course, but I would not see that our group is not legitimate because we have taken a policy position. I mean, it is based on science. It falls out of IR research. It falls out of international law. It falls out of STS research. It was all based on our political economy. I mean, this is kind of political economy, international relations, and STS. I mean, these are the three pillars, and they are driving, fully based on the science, they are driving this proposal. And I think that's, I mean, but it's a very interesting discussion. I mean, maybe I think the science community is also changing. This is maybe that the big science networks also have to change with the community. And the Earth and Governance Project, I don't know. But I think it's very important to go into these directions.
Frank, could you clarify, did the Earth System Governance Network take a position? Did it enter into this effort, or you left that organization did not take an official position, but individuals did?
Yeah, I mean, in a sense, so the network has never taken any position. Also, I mean, others, I mean, Stefan Bauer and Arti are now in the steering committee, and others probably also. And the reason is that there is no mechanism to take a position as a network, because then you would have to have some types of input and maybe some voting mechanism that we just don't have. But I mean, if you look at the list of those who have signed the open letter for the non-use agreement, and if you look at the same time at the membership of the Earth System Governance Project, I mean, there's a huge overlap. I mean, that's kind of what it is, because I mean,
but it's not a unanimous. You're not saying every member has to agree with this approach.
No, absolutely not. No, there are members of the Earth System Governance Project who did not sign for various reasons. And some people also just didn't care or are not informed, of course. And that's kind of, it's not that we kind of sent an email to everybody. So we did the usual stuff about contacts and Twitter, etc. And some people just didn't get it in the sense that this is going on. But it is not, we are not speaking on behalf of the Earth System or not on CSSN, but there is a huge, and there's also the question, also the support. I mean, what is the support actually that you want to give? I mean, that's the point also for CSN. I mean, where the one is, do you speak on behalf of the network? That's step one. And the other one, I think that is an easier one, is to grant support. And I think if the progressive communities, so to speak, if they're also resistant there, because they are being criticized from all sides, then it becomes very difficult to speak out. So I think that especially, I mean, I'm sitting in my university office. So it's kind of, so what does it mean? I mean, does it mean that it doesn't mean that Utrecht University is supporting this? It just means that I sit in my office, I use my laptop and the university laptop, and I take this position. But it doesn't mean that the university is responsible. I think that's maybe to be discussed.
Right. And sometimes our administrators are president of Brown University, but except, for example, I said it would be infringing on your rights as a citizen to take your academic freedom to not allow you to do that.
Yeah, this is of course a big debate, is academic freedom. But I think, I mean, academic freedom has, first of all, it's not unlimited. I mean, you can't develop a chemical bomb, you can't develop biological weapons, you can't do human cloning. So, I mean, this is not that academic freedom is there. And number two, it comes also with responsibility. And that's what I discussed also with my folks at my university, because these are the typical things. No? It's typical, the global north idea about we have the total freedom, but there's also a total responsibility. So I think this is a very interesting debate for us in academia, especially for these kind of proposals, where we are limiting, in a way, research on technology development in a certain direction, because we say this is not good. So that's I mean, it's, of course, everybody is happy. I mean, there are folks out there who want to research solar engineering. And then you have discussion at universities about what does it mean, what is the role of the university, and what can you do as an academic, and what are you allowed to do as an academic. And the same is probably for CSSN.
Well, thanks a lot for this very interesting debate. Thanks, Frank, for giving us your insights on on the topic and at various levels, and also on your reflections on the activism part. And I think we are a bit over time already, and should then come to an end of the session. Anyway, for me, it was very interesting step in here with the moderation, because I think it's such a pertinent topic that affects us all. And thanks a lot to the organizers to make that session happen. And Frank, for contributing in such a eloquent manner. And with that, I would like to hand over back to Timmons and Steffen. Thanks.
So applause. Thank you, Frank, and thank you, Ines, for stepping in at the last minute and being our moderators. Excellent. And so just to check with our OMSI and our support behind the stage, we are staying on this link, as I understand it. And somebody correct me if I'm wrong. So we're going to first hear from Steffen, and the idea is to sort of draw the big messages that we heard from the last 3 days, and then look ahead in the climate negotiations as it moves from Glasgow to Sharm el-Sheikh. So Steffen, why don't you give it a go? And I'll follow after you, and then we'll open the floor.
Thank you very much. I first had to unmute myself, and thanks again all participants, and especially Frank and Ines for this previous session, which I enjoyed very much and find very thought-provoking and inspiring. Now the big task is on me to come up with a bit of a start into a wrap-up of what has been a very impressive and very fruitful 3-day event, and to distill some takeaway messages, and also consider the context of the ongoing multilateral climate governance process. As you know, right next door, we have the SB sessions of the UNFCCC going on as an important milestone on the way to the COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh. So we also made a deliberate choice to have our conference in parallel with that. So some thoughts on that are also in order. Of course, as the SB meetings are concluding their first week only today, second week is to follow next week, the outcomes are, of course, not yet conclusive. But what I observed and also hear from others so far is that there are some signs that many of us have been hoping for ever since the Paris Agreement was adopted and eventually its work plan was developed. There are some signs that the process is actually shifting, however slowly, from negotiation only to operationalization and technical issues of implementation. So that is in some way an encouraging sign. That being said, of course, many sticky points remain. There is no shortage of controversy, and the discussions over loss and damage finance in particular that are going on in the context of the Glasgow dialogue, and we had a full session on that yesterday in the conference, are arguably the strongest case in point for such sticky points that still need to be solved and that are still very much in a political negotiation mode rather than in an technical implementation mode. And that very debate, as we also have learned yesterday in our loss and damage related session, key to restoring trust in the multilateral process, especially but not exclusively on the side of least developed countries, small island states. And that lack of trust puts at risk the very multilateral climate process, ironically, at a time when the Paris Agreement and its work program are finally in place and they would only need to be implemented. Yet we have these controversies and the lack of trust and amongst other things, the lack of a clear goal on adaptation and loss and damage finance and all that. So bringing this all back into our conference and what does it mean for us as researchers and social scientists that are concerned, seriously, deeply concerned with climate change and indeed climate governance, I would to start off, kick off this wrap-up session, 3 takeaways. And the first is plain and simple. If anything, this conference and the many contributions that we were able to listen to, including in the closed workshop sessions of the CSSN network as such, that all these contributions confirm to me very strongly that we as a group of researchers are actually onto something. There is a case and a need to research obstruction, to research greenwashing and protraction in climate governance. So that may be self-evident for most of us here, but by discussing these things, by listening to your contributions and the various angles and cases and the diversity of national perspectives really underscored this very strongly in my view. Then second, these very research efforts, that is something that I also take away with me. These research efforts need to look hard and even harder to know obstruction. So how do we know obstruction when we see it? And that is to say, it is, after all, not so easy. It's not trivial to tell active obstruction from what may be just path-dependent expressions of lock-in and business as usual that is also there in international climate governance. And to this end, I would like to echo a bit from Peter Newell's call. He gave, I think, a very strong presentation yesterday on the international political economy. And as a part of that, he called on us for like a multi-dimensional take on the political economy of climate governance, because after all, and that's not Peter's words, but what also resonates with me, we are social scientists and we are not conspiracy theorists. So it is very clear, and your research and our research is proof for that, that obstruction is a fact, and we do have the methods and the skills to unveil and to trace such obstruction empirically by our methods of empirical analysis in qualitative and quantitative ways. We must not assume that the proverbial man is behind everything that is not moving forward in multilateral climate governance. There are also other things that are slowing things down. So that requires a nuanced and clear analytical approach that is able to distinguish that. And then as a third takeaway, to face the challenge for our research to be relevant while at the same time being taken serious as researchers. And that I think links to many aspects that Frank has brought up in his talk just before this session. I believe we should, as researchers, as a social science community, we should pay more attention and invest more efforts to communicating our research to prospective multipliers. Frank put it that way, that scientists should not perform as activists, but rather coordinate and cooperate with NGOs to let them do the activist work, but harness scientific findings and scientific evidence to that end. So I think that we can improve and invest more on communicating our research, notably to media, also to civil society organizations, obviously, but also to the progressive-minded policymakers and government officials, which can in fact be found in almost every state in government. They are there, and they are also fighting their uphill struggles, and they can benefit from the research that we may provide. So, but we need to reach them. And improving such science communication should then also help us to avoid the pitfalls that Frank also spoke about, the pitfalls that we find on this very fine line between scholarship and activism that may easily backfire on our reputation as researchers, but should not stop us from normative research agendas and engaging in this activist stance. And to not take more time and to conclude, let me finally get back to thanks to Peter, let me get back to that Leonard Cohen quote, which has been, in a sense, has been ringing in my head ever since Peter brought it up yesterday. I repeat that Cohen quote: "There is a crack in everything. That is how the light gets in. There's a crack in everything. That is how the light gets in." That was the nice quote that Peter brought in his presentation from Leonard Cohen, and with that image in mind, I find and here's sort of also my appreciation of the Climate Social Science Network, which has been wonderful to work with, and it's really been great for us at German Development Institute and with my Klimalook project to engage with you guys and to make this conference happen. I find that the Climate Social Science Network is very well equipped to beam more light through the cracks of the murky space that is global climate governance. CSSN research may even widen such cracks or create new cracks to allow for ever more enlightenment within that murky space. And then to shine, additionally, CSSN research can shine some spotlights into the corners of that same murky space that are otherwise overlooked, and that provide the ecological niche for the very actors of obstruction that stand in the way of ambitious climate policy and in the way of more, not less, climate justice. So I leave you with that and hand back over to Timmons, and I'm looking forward to continuous discussion, because I think this conference really is a start and not and certainly not a one-off event. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Stefan. It's been a pleasure working with you all. I'm really sorry Okalu couldn't be here today and to speak after all, because she was sick. But again, thanks to DIE. So you remember 2 days ago, I put up a slide, here I'm going to share it, that talked about how our understanding of climate obstruction is poor. And I laid out sort of levels of governance at the international level, national level, local levels, and then economic sectors and strategies and tactics. So I thought I would sort of try to run through those and think about, you know, how are we doing, and what did we learn over this last 3 days? And I think for my, you know, I feel like I learned a lot from the national, the reports from our 8 scholars from Spain, Brazil, UK, Bangladesh, Australia, USA, and Sweden and Canada. And I could give examples from each one. I'm afraid that that would take a while, but those were extremely informative to me. And I think as we go forward, advancing this research agenda, we're going to have much more to say, and maybe you know, future conferences will have the whole time focused on the national level. We would learn quite a lot, I think, from that. So you know, we've had we've learned about the role of the fossil fuel industry in creating these carbon mafias and so on in Australia and Bangladesh, the coal industry and so on. And we've heard about, even in places like Spain, that the fossil fuel industry didn't really even need to be a major presence there, but rather it was managing to, sorry, I'm going to spotlight myself too. So we're not just stuck on Stefan. That there's really been efforts to block action on climate change, even without a large fossil fuel sector. And that's certainly what we found at some of the local levels in the United States. At the international level, I feel like we heard, especially on the case of compensation and liability or any kind of a financial mechanism on helping countries that have been impacted by losses and damages that can't be adapted to, that we had an excellent panel showing that it's that there has still been obstruction, that it's been 30 years since Vanuatu put in a proposal for an insurance mechanism that was based on, who caused the problem and who has the capacity to clean it up, who has the funds. And yet we've really seen no process on that, no progress on that. Thank you, Danielle, for that paper. But we heard from Raju Pandey about, sort of a divide and rule that's happening of the developing countries on this issue and on others, and that is a method. And so I'm sort of getting to the strategies and tactics that I feel like in the paper that Danielle and I and several others are working on, including at ICCAD, the International Center for Climate Change and Development in Bangladesh, that we are identifying some of the strategies in the negotiations, but we don't really know how it's getting done. I mean, how are the wealthy and powerful countries getting their way in terms of what's in the negotiating documents, what is off the table and what's on the table? So, Raju talked about divide and rule, and what it brings to mind for me is the importance of funding and international aid. And that is, some of these countries are highly dependent on foreign assistance, and the threat of, removing that assistance, or, a donor country not delivering that assistance is a likely way that countries are at least tacitly, if not explicitly, told how to vote on something, or how, what not to complain about, or to help the wealthier countries keep these issues off the docket. And in the WikiLeaks case, we learned that the United States did arm twisting, threatening developing countries to not fund them if they didn't support the Copenhagen Accord. That was during the Obama administration. So, there's got to be other methods that we still really don't know about. And I guess that would be what I think, that we really need a lot of leaks. We need insiders to tell us how this all happened behind the scenes. And I think we will have more leaks as more social scientists, poke around asking these kind of questions in the international arena, and the national arenas, and the local arena. So we have a lot of economic sectors to work. Oh, we also heard from Hans Joseph yesterday, in the fossil fuel session, talking about how activists, did okay at the local and national level in the European Union, but they were much weaker and tended to lose when issues got to Brussels. And so I think that's, the idea of venue shifting is really important, and it's a great strategy that those with resources are able to do effectively. There's much more. We've heard some about the fossil fuel sector, as I said, with Haro, talking about the need for fossil fuels if we're going to have any kind of a successful treaty, but we still have nothing left in the UN Framework Convention. But then we heard from Hossa from the CASPARC, or the really kind of an industry organization from Saudi Arabia, talking about how the fossil fuel industry, and especially Saudi Arabia, is investing in a circular economy approach, in carbon capture and storage, in diversification, and wanting a smooth transition. And it seemed to me that in all those cases, those could be seen as really trying to take the pressure off of their industry to make the change. So I'm going to sort of end up with a last point about strategy and tactics. There are many, and we're just starting to uncover many of them. And as people have noted, there's been a lot of shifting from denial, as Frank put it very well, to delay. As Bob would say, there's been delay all along, but now we're getting more of distraction, and this distraction has always been effective. But we need to understand the latter two more because we've focused a lot on climate denial. I agree with Peter's point, and Arti Gupta made the point as well today, that we need a positive side. We need to sort of keep hope alive here. That's the reason for our research, is to provide information that can be useful, but also I think it was put really nicely that there's in our closed session earlier, that there would be real value in understanding what strategies have been effective in overcoming obstruction, in understanding distraction and delay and denial. So we can learn a lot from looking at movements in the past and all these national and local cases. So I hope you all have learned a few things too. I was going to say one last thing, and that is lifting up the voices that haven't been heard. And that is really a sort of a political choice that Arti made just now. That is, we are taking normative positions and who we quote and in who we give the microphone to. And I hope in the next meeting of CSSN, we'll have a more diverse set of people getting the microphone. I see one hand here, and then we're down to the last 4 or 5 minutes, and it's Bob Brule. So Bob, why don't you bring us home?
All right, well, good. I just want to say something to Stefan, is that, no, we're not conspiracy theorists. However, that doesn't rule out that there are conspiracies. Is that if you look at the archives like I have, there are conspiracies. Very well developed, very well organized, very well funded. And, you know, the climate litigation trials are going to bring those out. So, you know, yes and no. In other words, I just wanted to say, you know, we can't rely on conspiracy theory, but there certainly are conspiracies. For me, I mean, as I watched all of this, I don't know that we're coming to grips with the level of sophistication of what I call climate obstruction, which is kind of just this general term for people who don't want to change the status quo. You know, because there's so many things that can go under it. But I mean, one of the things that we were talking about it at the international level is what I would say would be the creation of what Gramsci called a passive revolution in the academic world through fossil fuel industries, or, you know, vested interests, through their funding of big research institutes, Stanford, MIT, Harvard, Princeton, who then become dominant in the IPCC, literally have this kind of downstream 30-year program to systematically shift and shape the actual notion of climate science. I think sort of the funding of the universities working group needs to get together with the IPCC to see how those two work together. The other thing that I noted was that we have the beginnings of, we have lots and lots of particular research on different countries, but there's an international playbook. ExxonMobil, you know, it has a playbook run out of Houston, but it has worldwide PR programs. And I think Dieter's research is starting to open that up as far as to showing how the international coordination between all of these efforts at obstruction work. The other area we're going to have to open up is looking at multinational PR agencies, is that they will say they'll sell that one program in one country, they'll turn around and resell it, repackage it, sell it in a different country. Finally, my word is that my thing is, we're going to have to think about how do we integrate all of these strands of research into something that's digestible, that a digestible narrative that can be incorporated into the IPCC in a coherent way, that the press and the public can wrap their minds around? Because if we can't go, if we have a lot of particulars, but no through, thread or model, then we're going to end up with just that, a lot of particulars, a lot of this, that, oh, these people did something evil, and it won't show the systematic effect. So I don't know that anybody's really working on that level, and I think we're going to have to start thinking about that. And with that, I think this conference has been great.
Bob, that's a really nice way to put the task at hand. And of course, we need the particulars, and we need all the research at these different levels. We should be talking to the media in each, locality, each country, and to understand, as we understand the structure of obstruction in each of those places. So my job is just to close it out. I want to thank everybody for coming, and you've stayed on till the end. We appreciate your being here, and we hope there's been some value for you. The Climate Social Science Network is on the web. Please reach out. There's a link on our webpage about contact us. You can send us your thoughts. You can also ask to become a member if you aren't already. If you're a scholar, please do so. We are now over 300 members in about 35 countries. And for the members, we are now going to switch to a closed session, which is our final reception for virtual schmoozing. And we're going to close out this link, and I'll look forward to seeing many of you there. And again, thanks everybody. Thanks DIE. Thanks to We and Goliath. Amazing work on this event. You've really lifted us to a new level, and we really appreciate it very much. Take care.